Again, my plan is, you have a handout, my plan is to deal with 4 of the letters of Paul and to try to see what we can get out of those. So I'm going to give 4 talks, and after each talk there'll be time to read the letter and hopefully get something out of it. I will give some guidance on things that you might look for in the letter, but that will be wide open for everybody to see what they want to get out of it. The fixed times throughout the day are that we will eat lunch. When are we eating lunch? Somebody will appear and tell us that probably, but I'm thinking that 12:15 would be a good time for lunch. We'll see if that is countermanded anyway. So we got fixed times, 12:15 for lunch, and ending no later than 6. And Mass probably like around 4:45. So we make sure that Mass is done by 6. So we got some fixed times throughout the day. And I'm giving 4 talks. And this first one will probably be longer than the others, and there will be a lot of quiet time, then to read the letter, to reflect on it, think about it, and so on, and all kind of space around here. People can go meditate in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, or there's an outdoor meditation room, or there is my office and room are open, the staff dining room's open, there's a library over here. I see a lot of people with New Testaments, and that's sort of crucial. I think if you go in the library and if you don't have a New Testament, probably could get one in the library. So the idea is to be reading Paul's letters, so you've got to have a New Testament to do that. And I think there's probably some in the library, and there's the Jerusalem Bibles down in my office if somebody's looking for one. So we got the spiritual journey. Journey's a good metaphor for what we're all about in life, I think. Journey suggests that we're in some particular place and we're trying to get someplace else, that there's a goal, a destination. Journey suggests that you got to keep moving, walking along, or somehow traveling along. Journey has a feel to it that there's obstacles, that it isn't always just a smooth road, and you have to figure out how to manage that journey. The journey probably suggests that we're going to meet people along the way. There's other people around that we're journeying with, moving along with. So journeys have been a great metaphor for the spiritual life throughout all of Christian history, and in other traditions too, I might say. So we're on a journey, and we're trying to figure out how to make that journey better and more fruitfully and effectively and so on. And we're looking for guidance from Paul. And so we need to talk a little bit about Paul and get some feeling for him, so that we can get this guidance. Your notes are almost entirely taken from Ray Brown's introduction to the New Testament. So people have that book or know it. I mean, the notes are almost straight out of this book, and it's extremely helpful. Ray Brown is one of the great scripture scholars, deceased now, probably the best Catholic scripture scholar we ever produced in the United States. And so that's the kind of book that's helpful. I see some of you have the Catholic Study Bible. That's great. In fact, if people don't have that, that's a wonderful resource, especially the one that has notes by Jean Marie Hiesberger. If you're going to go buy one after this, make sure you get one that's got notes by Jean Marie Hiesberger. So this will be a wonderful guide for doing the reading. So when we're going to read 1 Thessalonians, you can find a study Bible, and there'll be a lot of good ideas for you in that. So that's helpful. I suppose one of the more provocative books lately has been In Search of Paul by John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan Reed. So we need to, well, we might talk a little bit about that. It's one of the latest studies that's out last year of Paul. It keeps vast literature on Paul, so Paul, he couldn't keep up with it all. So let's just think about him a little bit, who's going to be our guide throughout this and his letters. Paul was interesting fellow. You think he's born in Tarsus and grew up there. And I suppose what's important is he knew two worlds. So he was a Jew, as he says, and he was a Pharisee, interestingly enough. Within Judaism, there were different outlooks and so on, and he was proud of the fact that he was a Pharisee. And those Pharisees were very zealous for the law, very interested in keeping all of the elements of the law. But he also grew up in a city that was shaped by Hellenistic culture. So remember that the Romans had conquered that part of the world, and Palestine in, what was it, 63 BC. And so they spread the Hellenistic culture. That means that Paul knew Greek in addition to knowing Hebrew and probably Aramaic. He knew Greek, and he wrote those letters in Greek, and he wrote quite well. He was an educated man of the tribe of Benjamin. His name in Hebrew name was Saul, which of course we know he was named after the first king of the Israelites, Saul, who was of the tribe of Benjamin. And Paul tells us that himself. There were 12 tribes, and tells us that himself. He's of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew, Pharisee, tribe of Benjamin. So the fact that he knew those two cultures is really important in understanding what he was about. Because, just to go back through this, the rough story, which I presume most of us know in some degree, that he was a persecutor of the Christians. So he was one who he saw those who were claiming Jesus was the Messiah as like a heretical group within Judaism. And he was very upset by that. And to get this chronology in some order, most scholars think that Jesus died in the year 30, but probably at the age of 36. So Paul was about 10 to 15 years younger than Jesus, but never met him personally or wasn't part of his public ministry at all. So Paul, or Saul, that name as he was known in the Israelite world, saw this Christian group as a heretical group and persecutes them. As we know, he was at the martyrdom of the first martyr, the proto-martyr, Stephen. It says he was there when Stephen was killed, stoned to death. So he's zealous for the law. And then comes that time when it's all changed. He tells us in Galatians that God revealed his son Jesus to him. Now this brings up one of the elements of understanding Paul. There's two sources for understanding Paul. That is his own letters, and there are 7 undisputed letters of Paul. In the scriptures, it attributes many letters to Paul. Some of them we're very sure were not written by Paul, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And used to say, we don't even say this anymore, but the letter to the Hebrews, not written by Paul. And then there's the 7 letters that are clearly written by him. And then there's the ones that are disputed, like Ephesians and Colossians. Some people think he wrote them, and some people think other people wrote them. So, where was I going there? Letters. What was I on? Oh, yes, sources, yeah. So the sources for Paul's experiences are twofold. His letters, especially the 7 authentic letters, Romans, First Corinthians, and and 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon, Romans, Galatians. I guess I got them all in there. So that's one source. But the other source is the Acts of the Apostles, starting where is around chapter 6 or 7, when it starts bringing in the story of Paul. So it's interesting to see his conversion experiences, and let's just, when he himself is talking about it in the letter to the Galatians, here's his way of talking about himself. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin." He's defending himself. Galatians is really strident, defensive letter. "For I did not receive it from a human being, nor was I taught it. It came through a revelation of Jesus Christ." So that's how he got it. "For you heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it, and progressed in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my race, since I was even more a zealot for my ancestral traditions." So his love of Judaism and the strong Pharisaism. "But when God, who from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace," so his sense that God had called him from the very beginning, "was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him to the Gentiles." That's it. I mean, he revealed his Son to me. This is how he's telling us what happened. "I did not immediately consult flesh and blood." I didn't go to talk to anybody about it, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. I didn't go see Peter and James. "Rather, I went into Arabia and then returned to Damascus." And then he goes on to say it was only after 3 years after that he talked to the leaders, to Cephas and to James, and remained with them for 15 days. So after 3 years, he got this big experience after 3 years, and he's meditating, praying about this presumably. Then he goes and spends 15 days with the people who did know Jesus, and says he did not see any of the other apostles, only James, the brother of the Lord. So he goes on and tells his story. Now, that's pretty simple. God revealed Jesus to me. But the story that we all remember or remember comes from the Acts. And now the question that arises all throughout the Pauline scholarship is, I mean, what do you trust? If you're trying to figure out who's Paul, what was he about, I would say most scholars today think that we got to trust the letters and what he says himself. And when you get these expanded versions in the Acts of the Apostles, you're getting Luke's elaboration of it all. So I'm not sure we want to read through all of this, but do you remember this is in the 9th chapter of Acts? I'm using this to exemplify the point. There's 2 sources. And usually we go by the letters when they're in contradiction and not by the Acts. But now look how Luke plays this out. "Now Saul, still breathing murderous threats against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, that if he should find any men or women who belong to the way," that's what Christianity was called then, the way, "he might bring them back to Jerusalem in chains." So he seeks this out. On his journey, as he was nearing Damascus, a light from the sky suddenly flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He said, "Who are you, sir?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, for they heard the voice, but could see no one. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. He was blinded. So that they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. For 3 days, unable to see, and he neither ate nor drank. And that's when he encountered Ananias and so on, and the story goes on. So there's 2 sources for knowing about Paul: the Acts of the Apostles and That was in chapter 9 there, and the authentic letters of Paul. So we've got Paul now converted, changed, and he goes into retreat for 3 years, and then he begins his missionary journeys. So he then eventually takes the message into Europe, into Greece, northern Greece, around the year 50. And it is during the 50s that he writes these 7 authentic letters that we know about. And during this time, these missionary journeys were not easy. I'm going to read you, I'm not going to be doing this all day, but I'm going to read you another passage. This would be, a lot of the biographical information about Paul comes from 2 Corinthians. And so, you know, if you're, and that's not one of the 4 we're doing, but that would be a great one to see more. But that's where he tells us a lot about himself. And he often talks under boasting. So he's telling us now, this is to get a feel for his life as a missionary, what was going on. I mean, he wasn't traveling on a jet plane and jumping off and speaking into a microphone and, you know, having a press conference or something. I mean, this was a hard, difficult work that he was doing. You know, you envision him traveling for many miles trudging along, maybe with his few possessions, a knapsack, and walking along. He probably had to walk, probably didn't have any other means of getting around. And then he went on ships to get to her. So he's taken the message into Europe. So here's the way he's talking about this. But anyone dares to boast, I am speaking in foolishness. I also dare. So a lot of people think Paul was really arrogant, proud, and so on. A lot of it comes from this kind of thing. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I am talking like an insane person. I am still more, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, far worse beatings, and numerous brushes with death. 5 times at the hands of the Jews I received 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I passed a night and a day on the deep, on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own race, his own Jewish people, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, dangers among false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many sleepless nights, through hunger and thirst, through frequent fastings, through cold and exposure. And apart from these things, there is the daily pressure upon me of my anxiety for all of the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is led to sin, and I am not indignant? And he goes on to do some more boasting. So that's to give a feel for, he was a missionary. He's going on journeys, going along, preaching the word. And it's hard, and he's persecuted. So he's doing that largely in the 50s, without going into details about the dates. In the late 50s, he ends up in Jerusalem, gets in trouble again, he's arrested, and he, at that point, he appeals to Rome, which goes back to the idea that he was a Roman citizen. He couldn't crucify Paul like they did, put it that his crucified. And they had to appeal to Rome for justice. Did. It's taken to Rome. Commonly thought that he died martyr in the year 64. So looking at a relatively short time frame here, he probably converted about 36. That's a standard date. There is disputes about these, but when I'm originally converted as 36, spent ready 50 into big time action. and frequently prison, so on, shipwreck, all that. And then right around 58 or so, arrived in Jerusalem and appealed to Rome, and died. I don't know that from sources. It's something that somewhere. No, and that was so the rest of the means about 51. The other written of thing in the New Testament. So remember, I had found the David 51, Clark written around the 70. Gives some idea of all of that. So he writes before the earliest records we have of Christianity. Now, to me, Paul is he heard the message. He is based and that so then he went to and the road in Jerusalem. Heard a Jewish people. The metaphors is the kingdom of God. The parable is all about the kingdom of God. Jesus going around talking about the kingdom of God. And where so much of the understanding of Jesus is in terms of the Hebrew Scriptures. Who was he in the gospel? He's the suffering servant that we read about in Isaiah. He's the new David, who was the king of Israel after Saul. No, he's wiser than Solomon, David's son. He's the Son of Man that we read about in Daniel, comes on the clouds of heaven. All the metaphors, all the images for understanding Jesus are out of the Jewish world, out of the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, the genius of Paul was that he could take that fundamental truth of the death and resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish Messiah, understood in Jewish terms, who preached in that Jewish fashion, and preached in the Aramaic language and so on. Paul figured out how to take that and plant it in Europe, in Gentile soil, among people who were Hellenistic in their outlook. And thus he created what we would call a new paradigm of understanding Christianity. So for Paul, Jesus is the new Adam. Now just say the brilliance of that change. In other words, he's not going to go into Corinth, Greek-dominated city, and say, let me tell you about the son of David. Well, David who? I don't have any idea about David. Now let me tell you about the new Moses. He's not going to make it. There's no resonance. He can't do that. So one of his favorite images of Jesus then becomes the new Adam. Now we're back to something we can link into in the Greek mind. Yeah, this is taking us back to the beginning somehow. This is the first people. Whatever the first humans were, this Jesus is bringing a new creation. So instead of talking all about the kingdom, he begins to talk about this new creation that God has given us through Jesus. A new world, new opportunities, new way of living. And he borrows from the world of Stoic philosophy, things that they would know in their own culture. So he succeeded in producing a new paradigm of what Christianity was all about. And that's probably happened in history maybe only about, probably can count them on about two hands, when a whole new understanding of Christianity has appeared in the world. The other one would be clearly within the New Testament would be John. The Gospel of John, and how much different it sounds than the synoptics. And what an exalted Christology we find there. All the I ams. Before Abraham was I am. The Father and I are one. And it's so different. In other words, in John's Gospel, again, we don't get those parables. There's no parables in John's Gospel. We get a whole... So John also, or the beloved disciple, gives us a sort of a second New Testament paradigm. When I say paradigm, that's borrowed from the world of science. Thomas Kuhn talked about new paradigms in science. So when Einstein comes along and helps us understand the theory of relativity, then the Newtonian paradigm for understanding the world like a machine changes. Then we've got a new whole way of understanding the world. So in the history of science, that happens. And theologians have borrowed that from Thomas Kuhn, who writes about science, and said that's what's happening in Christianity. Periodically, great thinkers come along and give us a whole new way of understanding the faith. That's clear that has happened to me and Paul and John. And then it happened with Origen, a great Eastern father. It happened with, where'd he go? Augustine of Hippo. These things move, you know, at night. I don't know if I told you that. I don't know if you knew that. They play musical tapestries. They move around. You come in the next day and they're... Well, anyway, Augustine moved over there. So he creates a new paradigm, a whole new way of understanding it. Whereas another guy, Thomas Aquinas, he created a new paradigm. A whole new way of understanding Christianity through the categories of Aristotle's philosophy. We got another paradigm maker in the back there, Karl Rahner. So in history we've had that. So that's my model for understanding what Paul did. He gave a whole new way of understanding Christianity. And it made it in Gentile soil and planted it, and there it grew and developed, and we're so influenced by that. And now all throughout Christian history, people have come back to Paul for their new insight. So Augustine of Hippo, when he did his new paradigm, went back and reread Paul and brought out a lot of his ideas and reframed them and so on. That's what happened in the Protestant Reformation with Luther and Calvin. They were very influenced by Paul. They go back to his epistles, and especially Galatians and Romans, and rethink Christianity and produce a new paradigm, justification by faith. Big thing in the letter of Galatians. Well, that has to be nuanced a bit. And then in the 20th century, this happened again with the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth. He gave us a new paradigm again, what we call Protestant neo-Orthodox theology. His great book was Commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. So constantly throughout history that has happened. So that's one of the reasons Paul is really important. New paradigm maker. Secondly, because he's constantly influenced people throughout history. It influenced the rest of us then. And, I don't know, lastly, but again, another point, we listen to it when we come to Mass. We read from Paul. A lot of times the second reading is from a letter of Paul. So his influence continues in that way through the liturgy. Thus, it's good to be here. Thus, it's good to think about Paul because of his immense influence throughout the history of Christianity and how we keep coming back to it as a touchstone. Now, let me try to maybe help us read. We're going to be reading these letters, and the word letter is well taken. They are letters, and they have... They're modeled on classic letters in the Hellenistic world. It's another reason why Paul is, the Hellenized part of him, the Greek side of him, growing up in Tarsus is so important. He knew that world, so he didn't just sit down and write a letter. It's modeled on typical letters of the time. And so they open with a salutation. Usually, they don't all follow this, but generally there's a salutation. And often he will introduce himself and give his credentials. This is coming from Paul, called by God. He wants to know he's got authority in writing you this letter. Then there's usually a thanksgiving, where he's thanking God for the people he's writing to or other things that have happened. Then you get into the body of the letter, and in that body of the letter at the end, there's often a moral exhortation. It's a model that a lot of us use in preaching and teaching, and we put it this way: the imperative follows the indicative, meaning that when we figure out who we are, there will be a moral obligation that follows from that. So simply put, in Corinthians, the indicative is we're members of the body of Christ. That's who we are. By baptism, we're incorporated into the body of Christ. That indicative, that statement of fact, has an imperative. The imperative is, therefore, we better treat one another in a charitable way. So as move through the body of the letter, these 4 letters we're dealing with, or any of the 7, well, got to make an exception for Romans, but there will usually be a moral exhortation. Do this, live like this. And then there will be a closing to the letter. And usually maybe some sort of benediction or prayer. And sometimes he says, and now I'm going to sign it with my own hand so that you know it's from me. So, in other words, it's helpful to know there's a structure. When you're going to sit down and read 1 Thessalonians here, there's a structure to it that you can see and follow. In terms of reading it, we read it as an inspired work, as part of the Bible, as the Word of God. You could put it in more secular terms and say these letters are classics. They're classic works, and that means they have what we call a surplus of meaning. They have they have a universal message, more meaning than meets the eye. So that if you read 1 Thessalonians now and you've read it in the past, you would bring to it your new experiences, whatever's been going on in our lives, wherever we've gotten to on the spiritual journey. And to say it's inspired, that the Spirit's involved in it, that it's the Word of God, means there's always more to get out of it. So, I mean, you can't just sit there and say, well, I read Thessalonians years ago. Why am I going to read it again? Well, we read it again, or you could read it 10 days in a row, because it's inspired. Because there's a message there that can reach us and pull us out and move us forward in various ways. Trying to think of what else we need to think about before we move into trying to read. Well, let me stop and see if there's any questions. Yeah.
Would you say that part of the great influence that he had also, if you discuss it in the way you say chronologically, he was the first paradigm of Christianity.
Yeah.
There wasn't nobody else before him.
Right.
And he could be the model for anybody else who came after.
I think that's true. Yeah, the point is made that he's the first of the paradigm makers, and therefore a model for others, and sort of an invitation to others to rethink it. In other words, if it was rethought at the beginning, why couldn't we do it again? In fact, that argument is used right now in terms of Karl Rahner's approach to where we are in the world today. He died in 1984, but looking at the modern world. He says that we're living through the second great change in the history of Christianity. And the first great change was the one that Paul initiated and made happen. The first great change in Christianity was, do you have to be Jewish to be Christian? And there were those who said, well, yes, you do, of course. This is part of the dynamic of that first century. Yes, you must be Jewish. You must be circumcised. Males must be circumcised. They're going to be followers of Jesus. It seemed obvious to them. No, that Jesus was a Jew. He kept all the feasts. And Jesus was circumcised. Therefore, male followers of Jesus should be circumcised. So in that, Paul, and that's the Galatian story, was the one, who helped lead the fight for saying, no, you don't have to follow the Jewish law. You just have to be baptized. We're saved not by the law, the Jewish law, by the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, or by the whole Israel. We're not saved. We're saved by faith in Jesus. Now, your point is very astute, I believe. The dynamics at this time are the same. That is, how closed are we going to be in our understanding of Christianity, and how open? What are we going to impose? And you got the same fight that you had at the time of Paul. There are those who say that we have to take what we know as the Romanized, the European, maybe even the American European version of Christianity, and take that and give it to the rest of the world, to people in Africa or Asia or now China, which will be the new frontier of all of this. Or are we going to follow the model of Paul and say, no, you take the message and you plant it there and let it grow. And it will grow in its own way, just like happened the first time. So, in other words, we're into the same dynamic, and the model is Paul. For all the people who want to move in this other direction. The great example of that is Vincent Donovan, who wrote Christianity Revisited. What is it? Maybe it'll come to me. Anyway, he was the apostle to the missionary to the Maasai tribe. And he modeled himself on Paul. So he said, you know, I'm going to the Maasai tribe to preach, and I'm not going to tell them what to do. I'm just going to tell them the stories of Jesus. I'm going to tell them the stories. Tell them, you know, the Good Samaritan parable, and tell them the prodigal son parable, and tell them about Jesus, and so on. But I'm not going to take the Roman, European model of how one is a Christian and put it into the Maasai tribe. Say, here's how you do, here's how you celebrate Mass. It takes 52 minutes, and you do it this way and that way. You know, he didn't do that. He went in and just did like Paul, told the stories and planted the seed, and it grew. And it had this marvelous effect, because they used to take their old people and chain them to trees so to be devoured by the wild beasts. And after they heard the stories of Jesus and the gospel stories, then they kept the old people in the village and attended to them as they died. And they began to treat women better. And they developed their own liturgy. The old liturgy was all day long. And it had its own forms. They shared grass, which was a symbolic thing with the Maasai tribe in a sign of peace. So it all developed in its own way. So Karl Rahner's position is that we are now in the second great transition in the history of the church. The first one occurred in the first century, in the 50s, at the Council of Jerusalem, 49 or 50, and led by Paul was, do you have to constrict it? Do you have to be Jewish? Do the males have to be circumcised? Or is it open? And of course, the movement, you can imagine, what would the Jesus movement have been like if Paul had lost? I mean, you can just imagine. In all likelihood, Europe would have never been Christianized. It would have remained a tiny sect within Judaism. So that's the question at this time. And the people who, you know, as Rahner says, we're moving into the second great movement, change, transition in the history of the church, where for the first time we will get indigenous forms of Christianity, African Christianity and Asian Christianity, Chinese Christianity, that will grow out of that seed that's planted just like Paul planted it in the Gentile world. So yeah, I mean, that's ongoing influence. That's wonderful.
Another big question. Is there significance?
If my answer this one is long.
Are the letters in the Bible put in a chronological order?
No, they're in according to length.
Really?
Yeah. Romans is the first, the longest, yeah. No, it's not. And I've been wrestling all week to figure out what I was going to, whether I was going to follow the chronology or not. And I still wasn't sure until 2 minutes ago when I said Thessalonians. First one written is Thessalonians. And that's the one that I think we're going to read first. So, and from there, I wasn't sure how to go. In other words, I could do it thematically. There were different ways of doing this, and I have trouble figuring out what the best way was.
And this is not undisputed, right?
No, no. 1 Thessalonians as being the first letter is not a disputed point among that's known. Yeah, yeah. It's written around 51, something like that. Who else? Yes, Marianne.
You mentioned in Acts Luke's embellishment of Paul's conversion is contrasted to his own story. Doesn't that embellishment, doesn't that happen in the synoptics, that each tells his own story from his own viewpoint?
Of course, yeah. Point is made that the embellishment by Luke in Acts is not surprising. Acts is the second volume of a 2-volume work by the same author that we call Luke, and he did the same thing in his gospel. So did the others. So a great example of that is Mark, who was the original source of all of this, along with the Q document. So Mark is written around 70. That's the source for Matthew and Luke. So they're sitting there with that. And Mark says, well, he cured this one blind man. And what does Matthew say? Cured 2 blind men. You know, I mean, you can see how the embellishments occur. And sometimes you see also where things are taken away. But yes, the authors felt very free. It's not like our intellectual world where somebody's going to would accuse Matthew of plagiarism probably, and then distortion. So I mean, it's different. It's a different world. Yes, that was very common. And Luke's got a story to tell. Paul is a perfect foil for Luke, because remember what Luke's imagery is? Luke's imagery is that Jerusalem is the center. And Jesus is up here in Galilee, the northern part. He must go to Jerusalem. In fact, Luke says he sets his face on Jerusalem. He must go there. And it's in Jerusalem that the risen Lord, that Jesus is going to be crucified, and the risen Lord is going to appear to people. It's different from Mark. What does Mark say when it ends? Go to Galilee. That's where you will see him. In Mark's gospel, go to Galilee. That's where you'll see the resurrected Lord. And Luke, using Mark as his source, doesn't get that in there. Don't go to Galilee. He's going to meet you in Jerusalem. And then the beautiful picture, Luke's got this wonderful broad vision. Then the message and the power of Christ will spread from Jerusalem to the whole world. And where's the whole world? Rome. You know, that's what's going on here. So Paul is the perfect person. And Luke's sitting there, wow, the muses have hit me. You know, Paul's the perfect one to exemplify my theology, so to speak. Theology is it all goes to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem it spreads out. What did Paul do? Goes to Jerusalem, consults with the pillars, Peter, Cephas, and James, the brother of the Lord, and then takes it out. And where does he end up? In Rome. You know, he had intended to go to Spain. Rome was supposed to be a stop on the way to Spain. That's how big the thing, but it was better to stop in Rome from Luke's viewpoint, because that's the center of the world, the capital. Yes, so Luke's theological purpose is so often evident in his gospel. His theology, his big plan, influences how he sees things and reports things or writes about it. Yeah. Yeah.
So Paul writes a letter to the Thessalonians.
Yeah.
So he UPSs it down to the Thessalonians, and the Thessalonians, okay, circulated in their local community.
Yeah.
How does this disperse into the larger community?
Yeah.
Or,
becomes known, yeah. Because of Paul's reputation, you've got a letter signed in his own hand that we're circulating in Thessalonica, you know, and then the people in Corinth know about that, and they send a copy of the letter over to Corinth. So, and then it gets circulated in the broader Christian community. And as time goes on, these letters then are collected. Ray Brown thinks that actually that Paul wrote as many as 7 letters to the Corinthians, meaning we don't have them all. these other letters that didn't survive for one reason or another. But he sees traces of 7 different letters that Paul wrote. And some of these are combined. There's theories about the 2 Corinthians being the combination of 2 or 3 letters. So we're sitting there reading 2 Corinthians, but a lot of times it doesn't flow. And so the scholars think, well, the reason it doesn't flow is because it's a compilation of 2 other letters or 3 other letters. And so when you're reading it, if it doesn't flow, it doesn't, why do you jump here to there? It could well be what you're detecting is exactly what happened, that it's a compilation. So yeah, that occurs throughout. Yeah.
So the Christian community has these letters, so they're accepting, rejecting different thoughts and theologies at the time that eventually enter what we call the Bible, the
Yeah.
New Testament.
Right. This is right. Yeah. You got to remember, these letters all except Romans. Romans is an exception to talk about that. But the letters that we're looking at are all of what we've done, of what we've accomplished, of what we were deficient in. We leave nothing behind into the new life. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about what that's all about. Yeah.
I read this thing twice through and it really puzzled me as I read it. The only conclusion I could come up with is that I have no chance, the new creation, apart from all the rest of you, to bear the mark of the Spirit. I just don't have a ghost of a chance.
So you got that communal sense out of it.
Terrible.
Saved, and that's been part of it. We're saved as a member of a people. It's not me and God. It's not just a totally vertical relationship. It's just not me and God. And that's been our Catholic sense. We picked that up. That's why we gather for liturgy. That's why we form communities. That essential sense of the communal nature of salvation. I think Paul would be happy with that, reading. I think that's part of what he intended by all of this.
So I have a chance.
Yeah. And we all play a role in it. Yeah. Yes.
Why did Paul make such a point to say that if the second coming, the dead would go first, and then those who were left out?
Yeah.
Is there any?
Yes. I mean, the context of all of this is, in fact, it changes from one letter to the other. This is interesting. In this early writing, the larger context is Paul has what we call an imminent expectation of the second coming in 1 Thessalonians. You know, his clear mindset is this is going to happen pretty soon. In fact, he thinks it's going to happen in his lifetime. So he will be one of those that's still around and is raised up with the others. So, and so the language is we. You know, when we will be raised up like that. So he sees himself as this happening soon and being part of it. You know? So there's no problem here of, well, what are we going to do centuries from now? Because he thinks it's happening real soon. And that was that general expectation in those early decades. That the Lord would return soon. And there's gospel statements. This generation will not pass away till all these things have happened. That's put on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels. Now, according to the embarrassment criteria, one of the ways we try to figure out if something was really said by Jesus is it embarrassing or not? And if it's embarrassing, we can almost be sure he said it. I mean, if you're writing in the middle 80s, when this generation has already passed away, when they're all gone, for the most part, and you put in there, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away till all these things have happened. I mean, you're not going to make that up in the year 85. Well, because it makes Jesus look bad. So the theory is that he must have said things like that. And they remembered it, and they had to put, they made it part of it. So there was this imminent expectation that the end time was coming. And then it's only later And you see this progression in Paul's letters that where he later wrestles with this in Philippians of, geez, do I want to go now? Is it better to go now or to stay around and do this ministry that I'm doing? He's now faced with sort of a new question for himself. He puts that in there. You know, am I going to go now? Would I prefer that I die now so I can be with Jesus and enjoy the resurrection? Or would I stay around and keep ministering? So it's an important part of the what we call the eschatology, his large viewpoint of what's happening in the history of Christianity and of the world. So it's a framework within which the whole gospel of Jesus and Paul's teaching is set. It's vitally important. What he was convinced of was the parousia. That is what they call very often the second coming of Christ. When he would complete the work, just like he said. He's going to establish the kingdom, the second coming, then it's established. But that was a live option. They used to pray facing the east. So they would see him when he came on the clouds of heaven. That's why they faced the east, praying. Get ready for that. He'd come in the clouds of heaven and be ready for it. They were ready for it all the time. The question now becomes, for us, well, almost nobody has that expectation. We had it in the year 2000. As we approached it, there were a lot of Christians who were convinced it was going to happen, just like happened in the year 1000, I must say. And it's happened periodically throughout history, where people say, well, don't pay your mortgages. This is the end time. Or, yeah, and we had Christian people saying that as we approached 2000. And you might remember that. It was quite a large movement and so on. But for most people, the parousia is not imminent. It's not just right around the corner. So what are we going to do about it? What does it mean? My teacher, again, Ronner, said that we shouldn't talk about the second coming. No, because it makes it sound like he came once and then left us forever and then will return again. No, he wants to talk about that as the completion of Christ's work, because he's always here. Christ is always here in our midst and strengthening us, guiding us, forgiving us, and so on. His Spirit's always with us. And so the second, what we call the parousia, would be more the completion of his work, not a second coming. And that's an attempt to reinterpret this in a large frame when we've been going 2,000 years now and it hasn't come, and nobody's, you know, not many people at least are like expecting it tomorrow. In fact, for most Christians today, it's not a live part of our belief. And that's why Ronner wants to stress the idea that Christ is here now, in our midst, in our everyday activities. Anyway, it's a crucially important point you raise. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to go back to something you just mentioned where Paul is struggling with, would it be better for me to go now?
Yeah.
And that struck me as also a part of his conversations about death, because wouldn't someone, even some of the martyrs that we have today, you know, they say, I'm going to commit this act, I'm going to end now rather than continue on in the world trying to promote the philosophy or religion. But the other thing is suicide.
Yeah.
You know, and I wonder how many people who are depressed and going through dark times have these thoughts, because I've had friends express similar ideas, and he doesn't go on to elaborate on his thought process, you know, with all of that, how he goes from questioning it to, you know, where he eventually ends
Where he ends up, yeah.
Yeah, but I thought that was very relevant to those who have those kinds of dark thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question here is raised of suicide and how we think that through. I think the dominant category that comes into play, it comes from Paul as well, and that is that our total dependence upon God, and that everything that we are and are about, our very life, is gift from that God. And we don't have total disposal of it. You know, people feel that in terms of vocation in life, or of a call to commitment. There's something larger calling me to act in a certain way. The call of conscience and so on. And it's based on the idea that we're not autonomous beings. Many of us sense we're dependent, and therefore we're accountable. And therefore in that frame, which I think changes it, you can't just say, well, yeah, I got this great idea, I'll get to the Lord soon, and commit suicide. I find interesting those after-death experiences where the people who commit suicide don't see the light in the same way. I don't know what to make of all those. They're in a very shadowy kind of thing. Almost sounds like the Jewish Sheol to me. But anyway, that's an aside. But I think once one sees total dependence upon God and life as a gift, then the answer was there for Paul. He might have recognized it, but he had to keep ministering. Mm-hmm. He had to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
But the beautiful thing about Paul is that he expresses that very human struggle that goes on. I mean, he's in prison, people treat him shabbily and all of that. He's saying, well, do I really have to go on? Should I go on?
And which people resonate. I mean, there's Monday mornings when one wonders if one wants to get out of bed or not, Yeah. And the people who suffer from depression is just horrible. I mean, it's a darkness, terrible thing that makes it look all impossible and so on. I have to make a decision about time.
I was struck by the fact in 2 Thessalonians chapter 16 where he talks about the encouragement of God and the grace of God and how pertinent that is as much today over the centuries as it was in 51.
Yeah.
And also mentions that, and if you believe in that and work toward that end, may the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and the endurance of Christ.
What chapter and verse is that?
That's in chapter 3:5.
Yeah.
But it's just so important today and pertinent today as it was.
Right, yes it is, yeah.
Carried over the
It's a good example of a classic text. In other words, that speaks to our heart. That speaks to someone struggling today. Right?
Not only struggling, but getting an answer.
Yeah.
Getting the answers from God.
Yeah. Again, total dependence in everything we do. As I said, I got to make a decision here, what we're going to do. Last one, I think.
Well, I've struggled for years with this thought that when we pass over, when our physical body dies as we know it here, what happens? Is there a theology about this? In other words, I guess I've come to the conclusion that when we pass to the other side, and this is just my personal thoughts on this, there is another dimension that we go to while we wait for this completion of Christ. And I have no idea if that's really wrong or if there's a possibility. But when my husband was dying, one morning he woke up and said to me, "Are we here or are we there?"
Yeah.
And another
common.
time he said, "You know, we're all connected. I see we are all connected."
Yeah.
And so it makes me feel even more so that we pass from this state to another dimension where maybe there's no time where we see all things, because he was predicting things that happened later that he saw when he was in that state. And so is that against our faith to think of something like that?
Well, first of all, I think the comment is made about that when we pass over, which isn't a bad way of talking about what death is, to pass from one form of existence to another, that in that state there is a sort of organic unity and everyone is united, and that people get maybe premonitions of that ahead of time. And first of all, I think, yes, my answer to that is yes, you'll talk to people who have a sense of that. And what you just described, what your husband went through, is a classic mystical experience. And there's probably in this room 30% of people, if we're on average, that know what you're talking about by their own experience. I'm not really going to take a poll right now, but there are many people who know what you just said, what your husband experienced. That is, they've had their moments when all of the divisions seemed rather illusory, when all of the separation seemed not the most important thing, but the unity was more important. The classic mystical experience is where the divisions melt down and one feels united with the whole of reality, with the whole of the human family. It's an undifferentiated unity. It's like things aren't separate anymore. Again, I often draw on my teacher, Karl Rahner, but Rahner says he thinks that our resurrection happens immediately when we die, that there's not an interim period, that it's immediate. And purgatory, whatever it would be more instantaneous. Of course, in heaven, there's no watches and calendars. So, we move out of this time-space dimension. And Rahner also thinks that when your husband died, he became more related to you and his family and to the rest of the world than he was before. Just like we say about Jesus in his resurrection, when he was raised to life, he became more related to the human family, more related to all the parts of the earth than before. And again, that's speculation, that's theological speculation. I mean, nobody's been there and knows it and come back to tell us about it. But that is what one important theologian says, that what your husband experienced and sensed was what he thinks the reality is. That we're connected in, and we'll feel and see and know that connection, and we'll be more connected with this earth and people than we were before. From our viewpoint, they feel less connected because we don't see them and talk to them. My statement that I think I'm comfortable with is that I believe that my father is still for me, though he's deceased many years. To say that, I feel okay. I feel comfortable with saying that my father is still for me. I have no idea what that means in terms of the dynamics of the energy flow, but there's an energy flow I believe exists. And our communion of saints doctrine teaches us that. It's exactly what these figures teach us. We're in communion with them. That's what we say. And if we're communing with them, there's a flow. There's an energy flow. And if we think of ourselves as an energy matrix, then it's very possible for that to take many different forms. That energy matrix can take many different forms. And so when Paul talks about the spiritual body, maybe he's suggesting that energy matrix that I am takes other forms. But so those are live questions. But to me, rock bottom is your husband remains for you and remains related to you in his death. I don't know where we're going from here. Where are we going? That's good to hear from what people thought about Thessalonians. And people who didn't read anything, there's just one, it's chapter 4 that's in. I mean, it's not long. You can read it in a couple of minutes. That segment of the letter that talks about that. This isn't going to work. Obviously, it's not going to work. What am I going to do? Prepare for reading Galatians in one section. That's what I'm going to do. Sort of a quick thing on background to Galatians, and then we'll spend some time reading it's chapter 5 and 6. So I related Galatians to the freedom question. Freedom, big thing. We're big on freedom in the United States. We're blessed with freedom. We got religious liberty. We live in a world where a lot of people don't have that freedom, and we need to be grateful for it. We're also, and for us, freedom in this country has always meant getting our space. So we lived in a big country, so if you didn't like what was going on here on the East Coast, you moved west. You could always keep going west. You could keep going farther away. You could get away from people. Go up. The free person is, what was that movie? Easy Rider. That's the guy who's free. He has his motorcycle, you know. He's, wow. No ties. The Marlboro Man. No ties. Rides off. Out of the village, out of the town. Free. Free of all ties. So that's a big part of freedom in the United States. It feels very different from freedom in other places very often. So it's a freedom from, it's distance, it's my space. There, you know. So one of the things, you know, we'd say, well, what about that notion of freedom? Does it get critiqued in any way? You know, and then so now I'm looking at Galatians. So Paul wrote this thing in the middle 50s to people. It's actually disputed, but it's probably people who lived in modern-day Ankara, Turkey. There was a Roman province of Galatia, but most scholars think that isn't who he was writing to. He was writing to a group of Celts who had settled in the 3rd century BC around what is modern-day Ankara, Turkey, which is what about there? Where's our map? That never happened.
He's busy cooking.
Yeah, I know.
Give him a break.
Yeah, that's true. So that's where these people were, and Paul's there, and the Judaizers come, and they're saying Paul didn't preach the real gospel, and remember this, he wasn't there. He didn't know Jesus. So don't listen to him. He didn't know Jesus. So Paul, the whole letter of the Galatians is very defensive. It's combative. He's mad. He's writing his anger. He didn't sit down, write, and tear it up. Send it anyway. He's upset with these people. Yeah, right. Oh, Paul, settle down, rewrite it. Well, tomorrow, think it over. No, he's putting it out there. Taking them on. So he's not happy with these Judaizers, and he's defending himself. It's a defensive letter. He's got to defend himself. But then it gets to the section on freedom, which we find in chapters 5 and 6, which will be interesting reading. It starts out, chapter 5. Remember I told you the structure of a letter often has the opening thing and so on, and then there's a body, and usually at the end of that there's an exhortation. What does this mean about living? So that's how it's in the Bible. Exhortation to Christian living. And it starts out, for freedom, Christ set us free. Great line. Great line. For freedom, Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. Christ freed you. Don't be a slave. Don't be a slave to your own passions, to your own prejudices, to anything. Don't be a slave anymore. And then Paul goes on and talks about this freedom. For you were called for freedom, brothers and sisters. And then, now the caution. But do not use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Rather, serve one another through love. So he recognizes that part of what goes wrong with freedom at times is you end up thinking of it as license. Freedom means I can do whatever I want. My life is my own possession. That's how we've thought about sexuality in our culture. That our sexuality is our own autonomous possession. Therefore, we can do with it whatever we want. Therefore, maximize sexual experience or sexual pleasure. So that's been, it is a theme running through our culture. It's a freedom that looks a little strange in the light of this. For you are called to freedom. Do not use freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. And that's not just sex, I must say. That means anything that's going to be selfish, egocentric, take me away from God. It's almost like he's saying, don't see freedom as do your own thing. Rather, serve one another in love. What's freedom about serving one another in love? Well, so the invitation is for us to meditate on that in Galatians. Do we need to know anything else about that? Why don't we spend 15 minutes? The people who want to meditate can do that, and we'll eat at 12:15. And then, no, we need to know when we're going to reassemble. That's what we need to know. I want a longer break somewhere in the afternoon, probably. Here's my proposal, that we reassemble at 1, and then we'll do the next one, and then have a longer break for people who want to take a nap. And then we'll do the last one, and we'll have Mass at 1:15. Okay? So you got 15 minutes to work with freedom, or anything else in Galatians that you want.